Take it and leave, they said about the empty bakery. What she found under the oven brought tears. There was a woman, 46 years old, who stood in the mud outside a house that no longer belonged to her, holding a carpet bag with everything she owned in the world. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and the man who had put her there was her late husband's own brother, Silas Calloway, who told the county clerk that a widow with no children and no deed in her own name had no claim to land that carried the family name. What Ruth had left, after the wagon pulled away with her husband's tools and her mother's quilts sold off to pay debts she never made, was $11 sewn into the hem of her only good dress. With that $11, she bought the burned-out shell of the old Kettleman Bakery on the far end of Miller's Bend, Nebraska Territory, for $4 and the promise she would haul away her own ashes if the town ever wanted the lot back. Everyone said she was a fool for buying a building the fire had already claimed. They did not know that beneath the cracked hearth of that ruined oven lay something sealed away for 11 long years, something that would not just save one grieving woman, but would quietly, and rightfully, save an entire town from a debt it did not know it owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calloway. If you're watching this from a place that others have written off as finished, tell us where you're from in the comments below, and stay with us, because this story is for you. Ruth Calloway had been born in 1832 in a river town in Ohio, the second daughter of a miller named Ezra Whitfield, a man whose hands were always pale with flour and whose voice, when he taught his daughters the trade, never once suggested that baking bread was lesser work simply because it was done by women in an apron rather than men in a mill. Ezra had lost his own mother young, raised in a house where his aunt ran a bake shop to keep the family from starving after his father's boat went down on the Ohio River. And so he had grown into a man who understood, in his bones, that bread was not a small thing. Bread was the difference between a family staying together and a family scattering to wherever there was food. He taught this to Ruth before he taught her much else. She remembered standing on a wooden stool at 6 years old, her chin barely clearing the work table, watching her father fold dough with the patience of a man in prayer, and she remembered him saying, in that low voice he used only for the things he meant most, that a person who could make something out of flour and water and a little patience would never truly be poor, no matter what the ledger book said. Ruth held on to those words the way other children held on to toys. Her mother, Naomi, was a quieter woman, given to long silences and longer kindnesses, who taught Ruth the parts of baking that could not be written in any recipe book. How to listen to a loaf as it baked, how the crust would tell you, by the particular way it cracked, whether the fire beneath it ran too hot or too gentle. Naomi had also taught her daughters something else, something that would matter far more than either of them could have known. She taught them that when the town was hungry, whether from a bad harvest or a bad winter, the family gave bread away on Sundays and never spoke of it afterward, because true charity, Naomi said, did not need an audience. Ruth grew up watching lines of gaunt farmers and their children come quietly to the back door of the Whitfield Bakery on Sunday mornings, and she watched her mother fill their arms without a word of pity, only warmth, and she understood, even as a girl, that this was a kind of ministry that did not require a pulpit. When Ruth was 22, she married a young farmer named Thomas Calloway, a broad-shouldered, soft-spoken man from a family that had staked a claim out in the Nebraska Territory, drawn west by the promise of land that was theirs outright, land that no landlord or mill owner could take from them. Thomas had come east to visit cousins, had wandered into the Whitfield Bakery for no reason he could later explain except that the smell of the bread pulled him through the door, and had fallen in love with the miller's daughter who handed him a warm roll and refused to take his coin for it. They married within the year, and Ruth left the only home she had ever known to travel by wagon and by faith into a territory that was, in 1855, still more prairie grass than settlement, more sky than roof. The first years in Nebraska Territory were hard in a way that tested every lesson Ruth had ever learned. The soil was stubborn, the winters brutal, and more than once the Calloway household went to bed with less in their stomachs than they would have liked. But Ruth brought her father's patience and her mother's quiet generosity west with her, and even in those lean years, she found small ways to bake. A crust stretched thinner than it should have been, a loaf shared with a neighbor whose husband had broken his leg during planting season, a batch of biscuits carried 3 miles on foot to a family whose barn had burned. Thomas used to tease her gently that she would feed the whole territory before she fed herself, and Ruth would only smile and say that a person could always find enough if they were willing to look for it in the right places. Thomas's younger brother, Silas, had come out from Ohio a few years after them, restless and ambitious in ways that Thomas was not, always chasing some scheme that promised faster money than farming ever could. Silas never much liked Ruth. He thought her too plain in her ambitions, too content with small kindnesses when there was a whole territory to be conquered, and he made no secret, in the years that followed, that he believed his brother had married beneath what a Callaway man ought to expect. Ruth and Thomas built a modest but sturdy farmhouse together, raised what crops the land would allow, and settled into the rhythm of a marriage built less on passion than on a deep, abiding partnership. Two people who trusted each other completely, who worked from dawn until dusk, and who, though they were never blessed with children of their own, found a kind of quiet completeness in each other's company and in the small community of Miller's Bend that had grown up around the river crossing. Near their land, Ruth became known, in time, for the bread she brought to church suppers and barn raisings, for the way she never let a hungry face leave her doorstep without something in hand, and for a steadiness of character that made the women of the town trust her with their worries and the men respect her without quite knowing why. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of woman her mother had raised her to be. And for 23 years, that was enough. It was, in fact, everything. Then, in the spring of 1878, Thomas Callaway went out during a sudden hailstorm to bring in the last of the cattle, was struck by lightning not a quarter mile from the house, and did not come home. Ruth found him herself, in the gray light after the storm broke, and something in her that had always been steady broke quietly along with it, though she did not let herself show it. Not then, not at the funeral, not in the weeks that followed when the whole business of grief had to be conducted alongside the business of simply surviving. It was in those weeks, while Ruth was still learning how to breathe around the shape of her husband's absence, that Silas Callaway came to call, not with condolences, but with a lawyer from the county seat and a claim that the land, which had never been formally deeded in Ruth's name because Thomas had always meant to see to the paperwork and never had, belonged by rights to the nearest Callaway blood relation, which was to say, to Silas himself. Ruth fought it as best she could, going to the county clerk, to the circuit judge when he passed through, even writing a letter to a lawyer in Omaha that she could not afford to hire. But the territory's laws in those years gave little protection to a widow without a deed in her name, and Silas had money enough to make the process move quickly in his favor, and grief enough of his own excuse, or so he told himself, that he was only taking back what was rightfully Callaway property rather than letting a childless widow squander a good farm into ruin. By midsummer, Ruth stood in the yard of the house she had scrubbed and swept and loved for 23 years, watching a wagon carry away the last of what Silas allowed her to keep, which amounted to a carpet bag of clothing, her mother's rolling pin, and $11 that Silas handed over with the air of a man being extraordinarily generous, calling it her portion of the household goods he'd sold. He told her, without quite meeting her eyes, that she was young enough yet to remarry or find work as a housekeeper somewhere, and that he wished her well, though he said it the way a man says such things when he has already decided the matter does not concern him further. Ruth did not argue. She had learned, somewhere in the long months of losing Thomas and then losing the land they had built together, that arguing with a man who has already convinced himself he is in the right does very little good. She simply took her $11 and her carpet bag and walked into Miller's Bend to see what could be done with so little, in a town that was, in truth, not much bigger or more prosperous than she was. Miller's Bend itself had fallen on difficult times in those years, its fortunes tied too closely to a rail spur that had been promised and never built, its river trade dwindling as steamboats found easier crossings elsewhere, and its main street lined with more shuttered storefronts than open ones. It was on that street, walking with no particular destination beyond simply needing somewhere to sit and think, that Ruth passed the old Kettleman Bakery, a building she remembered dimly from her earliest years in the territory, back when a baker named Josiah Kettleman had run it before a kitchen fire gutted the back half of the building sometime around 1867, and the old man had simply locked the door and left, dying not long after in the county poorhouse with no kin anyone could name. The building had sat empty for over a decade, its windows broken by boys with rocks, its sign faded to illegibility, its ownership passed to the county for unpaid taxes and then largely forgotten, because who in a town already struggling would want a burned-out bakery with a caved section of roof and a reputation among the more superstitious residents for being unlucky? Ruth stood outside it for a long while, and something about the stubbornness of the building, half ruined but still standing, still holding its shape against 15 winters of neglect, spoke to something in her that she did not entirely understand herself. She went to the county land office the next morning and asked what it would take to buy it. And the clerk, a tired man named Hollis Wren who seemed almost embarrassed by the question, told her the county would be glad to be rid of the tax burden and would let her have it, structure and lot both, for $4, provided she signed papers agreeing the county bore no responsibility for whatever condition she found inside. Ruth paid the $4 on the spot, watched Hollis Wren's eyebrows climb with a mixture of pity and disbelief, and walked out holding a deed to a building that most of the town considered worth less than the nails that held its charred beams together. Behind her, she heard two women on the boardwalk murmuring to each other that the widow Calloway had lost her land and now, it seemed, her good sense as well, and one of them said, loud enough to be sure Ruth heard it, "Well, take it and leave, is what I'd have told her. That place has been cursed since Kettleman died in it, near enough." Ruth did not turn around. She had $7 left in the world, a burned building with a hole in its roof. And, though she could not have said why, the first real feeling of purpose she had known since the morning she found Thomas in the wet grass. She moved into the bakery that very afternoon, sweeping a corner of the least damaged room clean enough to lay her bedroll, and she spent her first days simply taking stock of what she had bought, in the way her father had taught her to take stock of any situation, not by what was ruined, but by what remained. The front room, where customers would once have stood at the counter, had suffered smoke damage, but its walls were sound. The oven itself, a great brick hearth built into the back wall by Josiah Kettleman's own hands sometime in the 1850s, had survived the fire almost entirely intact, its thick brick construction having done exactly what such ovens were built to do, which was to contain fire rather than spread it. It was, Ruth thought, turning it over in her mind as she cleared debris and swept ash for the better part of a week, the one truly valuable thing in the entire building. A good oven, well built, still sound after all these years, worth more by itself than she had paid for the whole lot. It was while clearing the hearth of that oven, on the fourth day, scraping out years of accumulated soot and the nests of mice who had long ago made a home in the cold firebox, that Ruth's fingers found something that did not belong among ash and rubble. It was a seam in the brickwork beneath the oven's foundation, a place where the mortar looked different from the mortar surrounding it, newer somehow, or at least laid by a different and more careful hand, forming a rectangle roughly the size of a large book, set into the floor of the firebox itself, hidden beneath where the coals would have burned. Ruth knelt there a long while, running her fingers along that seam, feeling the particular unevenness of it, and something in her, perhaps that old instinct her mother had given her for listening to what a loaf was trying to tell her, told her this was not simply a repair. This was something deliberately concealed. It took her the better part of 2 days, working carefully with a chisel borrowed from the blacksmith and no small amount of patience, to work the bricks loose without damaging whatever lay beneath them. And when she finally lifted the last brick free, she found a small cavity, dry and undisturbed, holding a tin box no larger than a Bible, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and had long since gone brittle and gray. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out into the daylight streaming through the broken roof, and she sat with it in her lap for several minutes before she found the courage to open it, because something about the careful way it had been hidden told her that whatever was inside had mattered enormously to whoever placed it there, and she felt, in that strange quiet moment, the weight of being the first person in perhaps 20 years to touch it. Inside the tin box, Ruth found 3 things. The first was a small leather ledger, its pages filled with the careful, cramped handwriting of a man recording sums of money. Purchases of flour, wages paid to a boy who swept the floors, small notations that read like the ordinary bookkeeping of a small-town bakery. The second was a canvas pouch, heavier than it looked, which when Ruth untied its drawstring spilled a modest fortune of gold and silver coin into her lap. more money than she had seen in one place in all her years in the territory. Enough, she understood immediately, to rebuild not just this bakery, but perhaps half the ruined storefronts on Miller's Bend's Main Street. And the third thing, tucked beneath the ledger, was a letter, its paper yellowed but its ink still legible, addressed simply to whoever finds this, in God's good time. Ruth read that letter with her hands shaking so badly she had to set it down twice before she finished it. It was written by Josiah Kettleman himself, dated the autumn of 1867, only weeks before the fire that had gutted his bakery, and it told a story that Ruth had never heard in all her years near Miller's Bend, a story the town itself seemed to have forgotten or never fully known. Josiah wrote that in 1859, when the town of Miller's Bend was young and struggling to establish itself as more than a river crossing, the founding town council had taken out a substantial loan from a bank in St. Joseph to fund the building of a proper grain mill and warehouse, infrastructure the town desperately needed to attract the trade of farmers from across the territory. The loan had been secured, in part, by a personal guarantee from 3 of the town's founding men, one of whom was Josiah Kettleman's own business partner and closest friend, a merchant named Aaron Pruitt, who had died suddenly of fever in 1861 before the loan was fully repaid, leaving Josiah as the last surviving guarantor and, in the eyes of the bank, personally responsible for the remaining debt. But Josiah's letter revealed something far stranger and sadder than a simple debt. He wrote that Aaron Pruitt, in the last months of his life, had confessed to him that the original council treasurer, a man named Cyrus Bell, had been quietly skimming funds from the town's accounts for years, funds meant for the mill and warehouse project, and that when the bank loan came due and the town coffers came up desperately short, it was Aaron and Josiah themselves who had secretly made up the difference from their own pockets, not wanting to shame the town or spark the kind of scandal that might have driven away the very settlers Miller's Bend needed to survive. Cyrus Bell, meanwhile, had used his stolen portion of those funds to quietly buy up land along the very route where the rail spur was later rumored to be built, land that would make his family wealthy for generations if the railroad ever came through, while the town he had robbed struggled on, never knowing why its accounts never quite balanced, why its promised prosperity always seemed to slip just out of reach. Josiah wrote that he had spent years afterward slowly, secretly repaying what remained of the town's true debt to the bank, using his own bakery earnings, hiding the surplus he managed to save beneath his own oven because he trusted no bank and no council member with knowledge of what he knew about Cyrus Bell, fearing what a man capable of such theft might do to protect his secret. And Cyrus Bell, Josiah's letter made clear, had grandsons still living in the county. The name, when Ruth read it, struck her like a physical blow, because Cyrus Bell was the maiden name of Silas Calloway's own mother, meaning that the wealth and standing the Calloway family had built in the territory, the very money and influence Silas had used to seize her farm, traced back, root and branch, to a theft from the town of Miller's Bend itself, a theft that had left honest men like Josiah Kettleman quietly ruining themselves in secret penance for another man's sin. Ruth sat in the wreckage of that bakery for a long time after she finished reading, the coins cold in her lap, the letter trembling in her hands, understanding all at once that she was holding not simply a fortune, but a truth that could unmake the comfortable standing of the very man who had cast her out into the mud with $11 and a carpet bag. She thought of her mother's teaching, that true charity did not require an audience. And she thought too of her father's words about how a person who could make something from flour and water and patience would never truly be poor. And she understood, sitting there, that Josiah Kettleman had believed something similar, that he had chosen, again and again, to quietly mend a wound rather than expose it, even at ruinous cost to himself. She resolved, in that hour, that whatever she did with what she had found, it would not be for her own gain alone. But she also knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that some truths could not stay buried forever, especially not when the man who benefited from the original theft was still, even now, taking from those who had least to spare. Word travels quickly in a small territory town, and it did not take long for whispers to start about the widow Calloway and her strange doings in the old Kettleman place, that she'd been seen buying lumber and nails from the mercantile with real coin, that she'd hired the Larkin boys to help clear the fire-damaged section of roof, that she paid the blacksmith in full and in advance for a new set of oven tools rather than promising payment later, as most in Miller's Bend were forced to do in those lean years. Ruth had gone to Hollis Wren at the land office first, showing him the ledger and letter, and Hollis, though shaken, confirmed that the town's old debt records from the 1860s had indeed always shown a curious discrepancy, sums that never quite added up, records that the current council had long since stopped questioning because questioning old debts served no one's interest. Ruth also went, quietly, to the town's aging Methodist minister, Reverend Amos Fairweather, a man known for his discretion and his long memory, and showed him what she had found, seeking counsel on how such a truth ought to be handled without simply tearing the town apart with scandal and accusation. It was Reverend Fairweather who gently warned her that Silas Calloway would not take kindly to any of this becoming known, and he was proven right within the week. Silas arrived at the bakery himself, uninvited, his face carrying the particular controlled fury of a man who has heard a rumor he desperately hopes is not true, and he demanded to know what Ruth thought she was doing, spreading tales about his mother's family, tales he called the bitter inventions of a woman embarrassed by her own poverty. He reminded her, with a coldness that made even the Larkin boys stop their hammering to listen, that she had no standing in this town, no deed to her name until $4 and a burned building, and that a woman in her position would do well to remember how quickly a town's sympathy could turn if certain people decided to speak against her character instead of for it. Ruth, for her part, did not raise her voice, did not accuse him outright of anything, but simply told him, in the same steady tone she used when explaining a recipe to a nervous new bride, that she intended to do what was right with what she had found, and that he was welcome to make his own peace with his family's history in whatever way he saw fit, but that she would not be threatened out of it. Silas did not let the matter rest there. In the weeks that followed, Ruth found her small rebuilding efforts quietly obstructed, the lumber yard suddenly claiming shortages when she came to order boards, a shipment of flour mysteriously delayed at the depot, two of the Larkin boys' father forbidding them to work for her further after what he called a friendly word of caution from Silas Calloway about associating with troublemakers. Some in town, swayed by Silas's standing and his family's long-cultivated reputation for respectability, began to eye Ruth with the same suspicion once reserved for Josiah Kettleman's cursed old bakery, murmuring that a woman who dug up old scandals to save her own skin was no better than a scavenger. Ruth felt the old loneliness of her widowhood pressing in again, sharper now for having briefly believed she had found solid ground beneath her feet, and there were nights, sitting alone in the half-repaired bakery with the coins locked away and the letter tucked beneath her mattress, when she wondered if she had only traded one kind of ruin for another. But it was in those difficult weeks that Ruth found an unexpected ally in Hollis Wren, who had quietly begun cross-referencing the old ledger's dates and figures against the county's original loan documents, still gathering dust in a records cabinet no one had opened in a decade, and who came to her one evening with a face full of grim vindication to confirm that Josiah Kettleman's account matched, almost to the dollar, a discrepancy in the town's founding financial records that had never been satisfactorily explained. She found another ally in Reverend Fairweather, who remembered Aaron Pruitt fondly from his own boyhood, and who quietly began speaking, in his gentle way, to the handful of townsfolk old enough to remember those early years, reminding them of what kind of men Josiah Kettleman and Aaron Pruitt had truly been, patient men, generous men, the kind who gave bread away on Sundays without asking for thanks. And she found, most surprisingly of all, an ally in old Martha Kessler, the very woman who had first told her to take the bakery and leave, who came to Ruth one morning with a basket of eggs by way of apology and confessed that her own late husband had once done business with Josiah Kettleman and had always maintained, quietly, that the old baker was the finest and most honest man Miller's Bend had ever known, and that whatever the town whispered about curses, the real curse, Martha said, had likely been wearing a fine coat and calling itself respectable all along. The matter came to its head at a town council meeting that autumn, called ostensibly to discuss the long-delayed question of whether Miller's Bend ought to petition the territory once more for the rail spur it had been promised for a decade, but which Ruth, with Hollis Wren and Reverend Fairweather standing beside her, used as an opportunity to lay the entire truth before the assembled town. The ledger, the letter, the coins, and the careful trail Hollis had traced through the old records, showing exactly how much of the town's founding debt Cyrus Bell had stolen and exactly how much land he had used those stolen funds to acquire along the very corridor now being surveyed for that long-promised rail line. Silas Calloway stood at the back of the hall, his face gone the color of old ash, and when several of the older farmers who had known Aaron Pruitt began to nod slowly along with Hollis Wren's account, murmuring that yes, they remembered the year the mill project nearly collapsed for want of funds, and then somehow did not, Silas understood, faster than anyone else in that room, that the ground beneath his family's respectability had just been pulled entirely away. He tried, briefly, to bluster his way past it, to call the whole matter ancient history dredged up by a bitter woman, but Reverend Fairweather, in his quiet way, simply asked whether Silas would be willing to have the county examine his own family's landholdings along the surveyed rail corridor, landholdings that, if traced back to Cyrus Bell's original theft, would rightfully belong not to the Calloway family, but to the town of Miller's Bend itself, since it was the town's stolen money that had purchased them in the first place. Silas had no answer for that. He left the hall that night without another word, and within a month, facing the very real possibility of a county investigation into his family's land titles, he quietly signed over a substantial portion of the disputed acreage to the town council in exchange for the matter being allowed to rest, land that included, Ruth noted with a feeling she could not quite name, the very farm that had once belonged to her and Thomas, since it bordered the corridor and had been folded into the family's holdings through the same tangled inheritance. The town council, moved by everything that had come to light, and perhaps eager to demonstrate that Miller's Bend could still act with honor even after so many years of quiet corruption, voted to return that particular parcel of land directly to Ruth Calloway, in her own name this time, with a proper deed that no brother-in-law could ever again contest. Ruth used a portion of the gold coins found beneath the oven, along with the returned land, to do exactly what she had resolved to do that first evening reading Josiah Kettleman's letter, not to keep the fortune for herself, but to finish what Josiah himself had spent his life trying to accomplish. She paid to have the town's small schoolhouse, long neglected and overcrowded, expanded with a proper second room. She funded the repair of the river crossing that had washed out twice in recent memory, endangering farmers bringing their grain to market. And she rebuilt the Kettleman Bakery not merely as her own shop, but as a place that, on Sundays, following her mother's old teaching, gave bread freely to whoever came hungry to its door, exactly as it seemed Josiah Kettleman himself had likely once done in his own quiet way, though no one now living could say for certain, since Josiah had never spoken of his own private charities any more than he had spoken of his private debts. And so it happened that Ruth Calloway, who had stood in the mud outside her own stolen home with $11 to her name, found herself, within a single year, the owner of a thriving bakery, a restored piece of her husband's family land, and a standing in Miller's Bend that no one, not even Silas Calloway, could any longer dismiss. But if you asked Ruth what mattered most in all of it, she would not point first to the coins or the land, or even the schoolhouse, though she was proud of each. She would tell you, as she told the women who came to sit with her over coffee in the years that followed, that what mattered most was the moment she knelt on that firebox floor and understood that somebody, long before her, had quietly chosen to do right even when doing right cost him everything and earned him nothing but a reputation for foolishness and a lonely death in a county poorhouse. She had bought a ruin for $4 because she had nowhere else to go, and what she found beneath its oven was not merely gold, though there was gold enough, but proof that kindness, hidden and unwitnessed, still finds its way into the light eventually, still does its quiet work across years and even decades, waiting only for someone patient enough and humble enough to dig it out. Ruth Calloway lived another 26 years in Miller's Bend, and the bakery she rebuilt stood, by the time she passed in 1904, as one of the most beloved buildings in the county, its ovens never once going cold on a Sunday morning, its doors never once turning away a hungry face, its walls, some said, still holding a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the fires burning within them. She never remarried, content instead in the community she had helped restore and the memory of the husband she had loved, and she never forgot the two women whose whispered words she had overheard on that first bitter morning. The ones who told her to take the ruined bakery and leave, because it was, after all, exactly what she had done. She had taken it, and she had left behind, for everyone who came after her, proof that even the things a town writes off as cursed or worthless may be holding, in their quiet foundations, the very restoration that town has been waiting years to receive. A woman with $11 and nothing else had walked past a building everyone called ruined, and had seen, instead, only what still remained standing, only what could yet be saved, and in the end, it was precisely that ruined, worthless, forgotten place that saved her back, and saved, alongside her, the whole quiet, struggling town that had so nearly given up on itself entirely. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Ruth Calloway's story. If it moved you, we'd be so grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that value often hides in the places we're quickest to write off. And if you have a moment, leave us a comment telling us about a time you found worth in something others had already given up on. An old house, an old friendship, an old piece of yourself you nearly let go. We read every one of them, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.